you spent part of your childhood in Mount Vernon, Illinois.
Right.
And I'm curious, along the way, what sort of values were imparted to you by your parents and the people you grew up around that served you well in your career?
Oh, you know, the values. I think the values imparted to me, and as I grew up every place, that is in Oklahoma and in Illinois, were very standard traditional American values. They were, I'm really having trouble deciding what I want to emphasize here.
That's all right.
Well, standard American values, such, for example, as doing your duty, if you will. I was said Harry Truman said, "Do your duty, and others will do well by you. History will do well by you," or something. I think I was just learned. I was always taught to do my duty. I was always taught to the Ten Commandment kinds of things. Honor my father and mother. That's and God, and do my homework well. Always do my best. Work hard. Sort of be as, sort of like that advertisement on television about the Army. Be all you can be. Make sure that you make use of whatever gifts you may have. Those were the sort of values I learned.
Were there particular people as you were growing up whom you admired a lot, whom you wanted to be like?
I don't think so. Not in my immediate environment, actually. I conceived of wanting to be like characters in history and characters in novels, and I was always a great reader, and I, as a great reader, I wanted to be like the brave and wonderful American heroes. That's including those who especially were learned. I was always very filled with admiration for scholarship and knowledge and wisdom, and I greatly admired Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, and I greatly admired Abraham Lincoln. In Illinois, I learned a great deal more about Abraham Lincoln than I had before, and that was I came very quickly to admire Lincoln a lot. I admired concert pianists. I admired all kinds of people, but they were in my more. I admired some people in my immediate environment, but not as role models. I was always sort of interested in doing sort of great things, if you will. And I took people in the larger world as role models, I think. Jane Austen I greatly admired, for example.
Let's see. You mentioned Lincoln, and it's only appropriate to talk about it. Lincoln was such a monumental character in so many ways. Self-taught in a lot of ways, but a tremendous intellect.
Right.
How do you feel now at this stage, being honored by the academy that bears his name?
Well, obviously, it moves me because I wouldn't have come otherwise, and I find it. A very unexpected and pleasant kind of a real honor. I think that Lincoln was a man of colossal knowledge and wisdom, self-taught to be sure, of great style in his writing and his speech, and of real moral strength and integrity, character, and I admire him tremendously.
A man of great courage who had to really draw upon those reserves, given the state of the Union at that time.
That's right. He was also, of course, a hard-headed politician too, with real political skills that he learned in the Illinois state legislature. I studied that. But Lincoln had faced problems as difficult as any president and more difficult than almost any president in our history. And his study of our history and his conviction and his courage and dedication, I think, made it possible for him to see his way through and our way through those terrible problems surrounding the Civil War.
Exactly. When we talked once before, I asked you if how did you come from going to high school, let's say, in Mount Vernon, Illinois, to the UN? It wasn't something you set out and planned for exactly.
Right. No, I told you, I think then, that someone had asked me that once when I was at the UN, and how it had gone about achieving a life ambition, and I laughed because it had never occurred to me that I might go to the UN. It never occurred to me until President-elect Reagan, called me on one occasion, after he had been elected, but before he was inaugurated, and said he wished that I would agree to go to be his United Nations representative and a member of his cabinet. And he simply called me and asked me just like that. And he said, he said, "How are you, Jeane?" I said, "Fine. How are you, Mr. President-elect?" And he said, "I'll be better if you will agree to be my UN ambassador and a member of my cabinet." And my response to that, I may have told you, was, "I'm not sure I can do that job, Mr. President." And he said, "I am. And I really want you to do that for me." And so I said, if he was, if he felt certain I could do it, then I would be happy to try. And that's how I became the UN ambassador.
What goes through your mind as you hear history called like that? Because you know that when you become ambassador to the United Nations, that you are going to be on center stage for world events, and it will be in the history books.
Well, let me say that what went through my mind when he asked me that, as I said, was, "I'm not sure I can do that, Mr. President." And I wasn't. That's the way I felt. And I didn't really fully conceive, I think, and understand the extent to which being the UN permanent representative, particularly in those last years of the Cold War, would in fact, make me and my actions a focus of public attention. I didn't really expect that. That came as something of a surprise as it happened. I didn't, I was very surprised when I was first appointed, and people seemed to be making such a fuss about it. And I remember saying to my husband, "I don't really understand why people think that what I'm about to do is so much more important than what I have been doing," because what I'd been doing was being a university professor, a good one, a writer, and I didn't quite understand the extent to which high-level political office attracts quite so much attention.
Let's pause for just a moment. Your collar on your... right there.
Is it all right there? No.
Let's see. No, actually, it's what it's doing is it's sticking out over the lapel.
Oh, okay.
Can you keep that underneath?
Yeah. I get it. Okay.
It's okay for the jacket to hang open.
Yeah, okay. Is that nice and neat?
We're okay.
Yeah, I think we'll be fine.
Okay. Well, I'd like to go back to that. As you said, going to the United Nations is permanent. At that time, at the last years of the Cold War, we had tens of thousands of megatons of nuclear weapons pointed at us and at the Soviet Union. What were the times like, and the gravity of the situation as it presented?
Well, we had tens of thousands of megatons of nuclear weapons aimed at us, of course. Many more. The Soviet Union had many times greater nuclear arsenals than we did, in fact. I think it was a dangerous time, and I think that it was more dangerous than most people understood. But it also was clear that we had to do absolutely everything possible to prevent conflict from erupting out of disagreement. And we in the Reagan administration, and I think our predecessors and our successors, worked to that end all the time, in all the arenas, in embassies and in bilateral negotiations and in the United Nations.
What was your toughest challenge upon arriving at the UN? Obviously, many things happened. But
well, look, the United States was in very bad shape at the UN when I arrived there, quite frankly. The United States was isolated and humiliated at will, really. It happened all the time. We were outvoted. We were so sort of helpless in the UN arena that even our best friends didn't want to associate with us. They preferred to keep a certain distance. And the challenge to me was to try to build the U.S. position inside the UN so that we could be more effective. You can't do any good in the world if you can't do anything. And we had really become quite impotent in that body.
What was the direction that President Reagan gave you to that end?
Well,
What did he want
we
to say?
we talked quite a bit. And I understood that he wanted me to defend our principles and our interests, make the case for democracy, make the case for free market, because he believed that the only road to development was a free market road to development. And he felt that no one had made the case well in recent period. And he wanted me to try to be as effective as I could in explaining our policies and winning support for them. And that's what I did.
How will history remember President Reagan? There are so many things to talk about, but in foreign policy, with what was accomplished there,
Right, was stunning. President Reagan really provided the leadership, not just for the United States, but for the Western world, really, that I think brought an end to the Cold War after decades of Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev deserves some credit for that. I want to say that, but Ronald Reagan deserves a very great deal of credit for creating the context in which that could happen. It was very wonderful to be part of that effort, I might say. How history remembers Ronald Reagan depends on who the historians are who write about the period. And most historians are liberals, if I may speak so bluntly. And we're not very enthusiastic. We're not admirers of Ronald Reagan. I think that as the partisan passions have cooled, some reevaluation on the part of our academic historians is already taking place. And I find it hard to believe that ultimately history will not understand that Ronald Reagan was a very important president in this century for the whole world, in fact.
Yeah, I remember as thinking of Ronald Reagan at first.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the last thing I would think of, with him actually cooling.
Right.
Yeah, that seems incredible.
And was the first man to do it.
Yeah. What was he like to work with?
Wonderful. He was a really wonderful boss, frankly. As an executive, Ronald Reagan was clear about goals and purposes, and he gave his members of his administration a fairly wide berth to try to achieve the goals, because he said he couldn't know everything about everything. And he was not a micromanager, but he stated the goals very clearly, and we understood generally, at least I certainly understood generally, how he wanted to be, how he wanted the administration to proceed. And from time to time, I would report to him and make sure that I understood, what how he was conceiving the situation then, but not very frequently. He gave encouragement, he gave guidance and clarity and no micromanagement. A lot of encouragement, though.
In talking to Jim Brady a year ago about this very same thing, he said that the main thing he wanted to do was leave the office. He had incredible respect for the office of the president.
That's right.
And wanted to leave things better than he found.
That's right. He did. He really did very much. He had lots of respect for the United States and for American history. He had a great deal of respect for the office of the presidency and for American government. And he wanted it to work, and he wanted it to be strong, and he wanted to contribute to that. He also very badly wanted to contribute to peace in the world, in fact, and relaxation of tensions and hostility in the world. I think he achieved both of those, frankly.
In terms of coming from an academic background to the practice of real politics in the larger setting, how was it different for you, as opposed to someone who's been an observer and someone who's chronicled things?
It was a big shock. Well, I had been somewhat active in politics, but at sort of low levels and unimportant ways, you know. And it was a very big shock. American politics is much rougher. There's much more harshness in it than I realized, frankly. And there's more meanness. There's more lying and leaking and all that sort of thing, frankly, than I ever realized. But and I thought I was not very temperamentally well suited for politics. I always feel I would rather write about politics. I'd rather watch it than do it, you know. But I also think that citizens in a democracy have an opportunity to serve when they're called upon to do what they can. So I did.
How did you emerge from the experience in terms of the focus or the vision that it gave you?
Well, I've never learned so much in my life as I did in those 4.5 years. Really, I mean, it was a fantastic educational experience for me about the world, because the UN is a place where you have a vision of the whole world, you have perspective on the whole world. I learned about how nations deal with each other and who deals with whom, and it doesn't necessarily always coincide with the public images, in fact. And I learned a lot about how American government works, and I really emerged, I think, much more knowledgeable about both our government and the world than I went into it. Much more knowledgeable.
Mm-hmm. I know that we're running short on time.
Sorry.
Among the world leaders you had an opportunity to meet, and you met an awful lot of them, who really stands out as someone of substance? If you can name 4 or 5 that you really admire.
Besides Ronald Reagan.
Sure.
Right. Margaret Thatcher, very impressive woman, enormously impressive woman. Great, like Reagan, great sense of purpose and determination, eloquence, and like Reagan, enormously articulate and smart, just smart. That's Helmut Kohl is a very impressive person to me, has a very sort of long view. So let me say to Margaret Thatcher, I have a long view, but Kohl always had a long view, and he was, of course, very dedicated to the West and to Germany's full membership in the West. Helmut Kohl was very determined to integrate Germany into Europe, to have a European Germany, not a German Europe, and he's been more recently, of course, very engaged in the unification of Germany and rebuilding East Germany. He would like to see a democratic Central Europe, of course, which we would all like to see. But he's worked very consistently now over a long time to achieve that, and he's made great progress.
What about, as you consider the world at this point in its history, where do you find the most danger to peace and the most promise for peace?
Well, I think that there are 2 great uncertain areas today, either one of which can evolve is to strengthen peace or to create real dangers. For the moment, I don't think there are any sort of active dangers for the whole world. But I think that the evolution of Russia to a sort of stable democracy is enormously important. If Russia can come through these next elections, the June 16th elections, and with a Democrat in the presidency and a strengthened commitment to democracy, that'll be very, very important for Russia, for Europe, for the United States, for the world. China's evolution is also very important because China today remains a totalitarian dictatorship, in fact. It's too bad, but it's a fact. And Deng Xiaoping, who has been the liberalizer and moderator in China, is in his 90s and will completely pass from the scene before long. The struggle over his succession is already underway, and I think it's clear that some of those who might succeed him are more volatile and more violent, perhaps, than Deng Xiaoping himself has been. So, and I think that the peace in Asia is less certain today than it was, a decade ago when Deng Xiaoping was fully in charge.
I know we're running out of time now, but as you reflect upon your career, what moment or moments gave you the greatest satisfaction, professional satisfaction, personal satisfaction?
I found moments I'm not sure about. I don't think that there were some nice victories, if you will, at the UN. And I felt very challenged about 007 because I think it was a terrible thing that the Soviets had shot down a civilian airliner, killing 269 people, and with the world politics being what it was not at all certain that the Soviet Union would even be reproached for that or condemned in any way, and or even forced to veto a resolution that would condemn them. And I worked very hard with the U.S. mission and others, and Japan and Korea, and on that. And basically, we were able to at least secure a condemnation in the Security Council of that really terrible action, and that was gratifying to me because that hadn't happened for many, many, many years. I think that I was pleased in the reception of my speech at the Republican Convention in 1984. That was a moment of satisfaction for me and pleasure personally. I think my greatest satisfactions and pleasures have been with my family. However,
we stop for just a second. Let that tone down. If you would pick up again.
My greatest satisfactions, personal satisfactions, have been with my family. My greatest pleasures have been with my family, my husband and my 3 sons, my parents, my brother. I'm a very family-oriented person. I've liked some of it, and I've had a wonderful time on some vacations with my husband and with my family. I like to cook, and succeeding at a perfect souffle is pretty satifying too.
I was going to say, what would someone not expect about you?
Right. Well, maybe that's it.
Oh, that right there.
Maybe that's it. Yeah.
Let's see. One quick question, if I might, about with this current situation between Israel and the Hezbollah.
Right.
For our newscast. How do you think that's going to play itself out?
It's remarkably like the situations that existed at least twice while I was at the United Nations. And, it's a terrible, terrible situation. Because the Hezbollah are... the source of this problem is Hafez al-Assad in Syria. There's just no question about that. Because he backs the Hezbollah, who are Iranian, actually, in an alliance with Iran. Assad backs the Hezbollah and has really taken control of Lebanon. One thing most Americans don't understand, most people don't understand, is that Lebanon is really no longer an independent country. It's a kind of vassal state of Syria, and it's controlled by Assad. And he permits these terrorists, which is what the Hezbollah are, who make continual war on civilians in Israel, not against the IDF, the Israeli army, but against civilians in Israel. And so the Israelis, so they fire into Israeli villages and kill Israelis, and the Israeli army eventually fires back, as it must, if it has exhausted diplomatic means, which it has. Shimon Peres, no one has ever worked so hard for peace and offered as much, I think, as Shimon Peres has offered to Hafez al-Assad. And Assad won't take peace at any price. I think this is what we've really seen. So Israel fires back, naturally. And when you fire, and not only do the Hezbollah start it by their aggressive action, but the Hezbollah implant themselves in civilian neighborhoods and next to UN buildings or hospitals or in refugee camps. And so if the Israelis fire at the source of fire into an Israeli village, it's eventually going to hit one of these civilian, sort of symbols, as, like a refugee camp or a hospital or a UN building, as happened. I think that was a refugee camp, in fact, the other day. So it creates a great global outcry. It's frustrating. It's sad. And I don't know. Eventually, either Assad is going. I think he'll probably call off the military offensive now. Shimon Peres cannot. He simply cannot for two different reasons. One is that he himself is facing an election. And the Israeli people simply will never accept a president who does not defend the country against the kind of aggression that the Hezbollah have engaged in. And two, Shimon Peres wants to defend Israel against aggression of that sort. And so I think that this will go on until Hafez al-Assad decides that it's no longer worth his while to continue it at this time, and he'll call them off for a while. That's what he's done in the past.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.